this is a global system. It has so many feeds. It has so many powerful entities have stakes in continuing the operation of the system as it is. And you think, even if you are alarmed about it, even if you're terrified about it, you think, what could I possibly do? I'm just one person.
Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thanks for watching ENQUIRY. The news changes so fast these days that sometimes it's easy to forget that the one big constant story out there is climate change. Even as the world is struggling to recover from the pandemic, we're being repeatedly hit by extreme weather events: fires in California, snows in Texas, glacier bursts in India. In fact, a CDP report this week said that top Indian banks peg their climate risk assets at 6.9 trillion rupees, which is a staggering $86 billion. And still, climate change seems a remote phenomenon. So I'm delighted to have on the show today writer and journalist David Wallace-Wells. David wrote a book called The Uninhabitable Earth 2 years ago, which painted such a grim and terrifying picture that it made headlines. And yet today, David says he's cautiously optimistic. So at a time when so much is going wrong, I'm curious to know what's making David hopeful. Thank you so much for joining me on the show, David.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
So David, I wanted to start with your publishing The Uninhabitable Earth. You know, it made global headlines for the way it scared everybody. And you said that fear, in fact, was the trigger that brought you into being concerned about the climate, you know. So I want to start with that. Like, blow the brains out of everyone who's listening now and those who haven't read your book. What was the most scary things you discovered when you were researching the book? And what particularly triggered your fear?
Well, what really got me worried enough about climate change to spend, a good chunk of my professional life now working on it was that in the immediate aftermath of the presidential election in 2016, there was a string of days in the Arctic that were 40 degrees Celsius warmer than they normally were. And I knew enough about climate change then to be worried that we were starting to see some real dramatic and sudden shifts in the Earth's climate. It turned out that this is not really the case. It was a sign of changes, but it wasn't a harbinger of much of real acceleration. But I had sort of been pulled along by that news event into a place where I was really eager to see just how bad scientists thought things could get, especially if left unchecked. And the deeper I got into that research and the more time I spent thinking about that work and talking to the people who were doing it, really the scarier it got. But I would say now, the thing that scares me the most is not the truly most terrifying possible outcomes, because I think, especially because of the progress that's been made over the last couple of years, those are looking less and less likely. What's scariest to me now is that our best case scenarios remain quite grim. So even if we imagine a maximal, rapid, global response, decarbonization at something like its fastest possible pace, I think we're still going to be living in a world that is really defined in quite profound ways by the forces of climate impacts. And by that I mean landing something at about 2 degrees Celsius of warming above the pre-industrial average, a little less than twice as much warming as we have today. And at 2 degrees of warming, scientists say we would expect 150 million people to die of air pollution. We'd expect storms and flooding events that used to hit once a century to hit every single year. And we'd expect many cities in South Asia and across the Middle East to become so hot during summer that, many days of the year you wouldn't be able to walk around outside without risking heat stroke or death. And at just 2 degrees, just to, put a very particular point on it, at 2 degrees, some research that I was just looking at the other day suggested that in Calcutta, you would have 199 days of lethal heat every single year. And this is a temperature level that we're likely to reach somewhere between 2040 or 2050. Maybe we'll be able to push that back a little longer if we move quickly. But I think functionally it's inevitable, and we're going to have to find ways of living amidst and against and protecting ourselves from those kinds of climate assaults, which will be will be with us and will be all around us very soon.
So, David, typically when one says 2050, one thinks of it in beyond the fog of time, so I think it's important to remind ourselves that we're just talking about something that's 25 years away or 30 years away, within our lifetime. Because very often when you talk about future generations, people switch off. So the imminence of it is really something that one needs to emphasize. But like I said, David, and there's a very interesting thing that's happened. I've been reading about your a shift in your attitude, and you were seen as the climate alarmist, the climate pessimist, and recently you've been sounding like a climate optimist. You're feeling hopeful about things, and I'm going to draw you there. But before that, like I said, I'm imagining in our audience there'll be a lot of people who haven't yet tuned in. So if you don't mind regurgitating some of the terror that you unleashed in your book, in the longscape and in the shortscape. So what could happen in the future, and just in the immediate, what is happening and we're still being blind to,
Well, yeah, the last major UN climate report suggested that we were on an emissions path that would land us somewhere between 4 degrees and 5 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. As I said a few minutes ago, I think that's increasingly unlikely, but at that level of warming, which is still possible, it's just much less likely, we would be talking about a world that had more than twice as much war, because there's a relationship between temperature and conflict. It would mean $600 trillion in global climate damages, which is twice as much wealth as exists in the world today. Parts of the planet could be hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once. And according to the UN, we'd be seeing large-scale global migration crises, numbering more than 100 million and possibly as many as 1 billion global climate migrants. These are impacts that go well beyond our ability, in the present tense at least, to adjust or adapt to. It would mean a deep, scrambling tumult of all of our societies and civilizations, although those impacts will be not visited or distributed equally. And in fact, India is likely to be the most hard-hit nation in the entire planet, with something like a quarter of all global climate impacts concentrated there. Countries in the Why is that? Well, part of it is just geography, which is to say that countries that lie along the equator are more vulnerable. The truth is actually that the Arctic and Antarctic are also being transformed very dramatically, but because people don't really live there, the impacts aren't all that intense. On the equator, especially in places where it's very hot, you have lots of, we're sort of living already close to the boundaries of human capacity. That's not to say that, at 3 degrees or 4 degrees, literally everybody in a city will drop dead from direct heat, but we will see many, many, many more people dying every year from heat strokes, and we will see a much more dramatic effect on, say, cognitive performance and economic activity, in addition to many of the other sort of impacts having to do with, say, infrastructure, where you have train tracks bent by the heat, you have airplanes unable to take off or land, you have flooding events along all of the river deltas, really, really dramatic impacts there. And at the same time, droughts, and at the same time as you have dramatic flooding events, you also have droughts and heat waves that are crippling to agriculture. And these are features or impacts that are going to be visible everywhere in the world. You won't be able to escape them, no matter where you live or how wealthy you are. But it is an unfortunate and tragic feature of the climate system that many of those impacts are going to be visited most intensely on developing countries who lack many of the resources that those in the global north have to respond to them. So, for instance, I live in New York City. I think it's almost inevitable that over the next few decades, we build a seawall to protect the city from sea level rise and flooding, like we saw from Hurricane Sandy. That's going to cost $100 billion or more. The estimate is $100 billion, which means inevitably it'll be more than that. It's worth it in New York because the real estate is that valuable. But there are going to be many parts, even of the eastern seaboard of the US, that are judged uneconomical to save. And in fact, the American Army Corps of Engineers, which does a lot of this ambitious infrastructure planning, in developing a plan to deal with Miami Beach, which is one of our most, or I should say Miami, one of our most vulnerable parts of the country, has proposed building sea barriers, flood barriers only on the mainland, and basically letting the barrier island Miami Beach disappear into the sea. And that's a place that has also extremely expensive real estate. So the fact that there seems to be some logic to letting it go is a sign of just how capital intensive many of these defensive infrastructure projects will be. And then if you think about the same challenges being faced by low-lying areas in the developing world, it's going to be a lot harder to find that money to build those projects, especially if they are only funded domestically, nationally, rather than through some international arrangement. And so you're likely to see many more adaptation projects like we've seen in Bangladesh, where there's been a sort of concrete bunker system and early warning for floods and typhoons, without truly protecting the parts of the country that are most vulnerable. And that can save lives and it can preserve property to some degree, but it's still a sort of a half measure because the full-scale measures are likely to just be too expensive, almost in almost any part of the world, and certainly in parts of the world that are among the poorer countries.
So, David, typically, again, when one speaks of sea level rise or of the Arctic ice falling apart, you've spoken about the kind of diseases that might come out of the permafrost, melting. But it all seems in the future, so people, again, like glaze out on it. It seems someone else's problem. So now just telescoping in, can you speak of some of the things that we're just seeing as we live today? And which are very, very stark examples of what will happen, not just will happen, which is already unfolding. Like I would count the Australia fires or the California fires, the droughts, the extreme events, Texas snow, but people don't seem to even be reacting to that yet, So can you spell out some of the immediacies of it?
Yeah, but before I even get to that, I'll say one way of thinking about the timeline is that even, as you say, 2050 can feel far away. But some of these infrastructure projects that I'm talking about as possibly helping us live in this new world, they often take 20 or 50 years to build, which means that we have to start now to adapt to the climate of 2050. And in that sense, we are sort of already living in that moment 30 years down the line. And so timelines that seem relatively long are actually quite short. Of course, they're much shorter than I thought they were a few years ago when I started working on this material, and certainly much shorter than I thought they were when I was, a teenager in my 20s and hearing about climate change. Because often then this problem was really talked about, as you say, as a story of generations, a generational responsibility, and as a result, I think people were quite slow to respond and didn't understand just how urgent action really was. But today we're at 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming. And again, that doesn't sound like very much. It sounds, like a day that's 1 degree warmer is manageable. But it actually puts us entirely outside the window of temperatures that enclose all of human history. So since the invention of agriculture, the development of everything we know of as civilization, all of our culture, all of our politics, all of our technology, all of that has taken place under climate conditions that we've now already left behind. The planet's climate was very stable for all of that time. And in fact, the stability of the climate was one reason why human flourishing was possible to the degree that it was. And now we are changing the planet's climate, not just beyond the scope of what humans have lived with before, but much, much faster than any transformation ever in the history of the planet. And that includes climate transformations that wiped out as many as 97% of all life on Earth. So I don't, because humans are here and sort of in charge, I don't think it's likely that we're going to see that scale of devastation and destruction, because we will be trying to manage to the extent that we can and trying to adapt to the extent that we can, and we'll be protecting at least some of the natural ecosystems and species on the planet. And yet it gives you a sense of just how dramatic the kinds of changes that we're unleashing today really are, if they tower above the sorts of changes that used to, in the planet's deep history, wipe out, practically speaking, all life on Earth. Yeah. And so what we're seeing today is really dramatic changes. We're talking about, you mentioned the fires in Australia. the air was so thick in Sydney Harbor there that ferries couldn't run. Fire alarms were going off inside office buildings because they thought that there was a fire in the building. That's how thick the smoke was. More than 1 billion animals were killed. They had to evacuate people from the beach in a kind of military style evacuation that hadn't been seen since World War II. In California, I did reporting on the California fires in 2019, and I spoke to Eric Garcetti, who's the mayor of LA. And in the year that he was born, 60,000 acres burned in the state. In the year he was elected mayor, in 2013, it was 600,000, so a tenfold increase in 47 years or something. The year he was reelected in 2017, it was 1.2 million acres, so doubling in just 4 years. And then in 2018, the year before I went out to California, it was 1.89 million. So again, a 50% increase in just a single year. And these fire seasons are truly historic. They are bigger than anything that has ever happened in California history. There are some people who will tell you, many thousands of years ago that there was much more burning, which is true, but there also weren't 40 million people living in the state. And it's that combination of human habitation and development and the fragility and brutality of the new climate environment that is really at stake here and important here. But even that record-setting year that I mentioned in 2018, which was so much bigger than anything California had ever seen before, was less than half of the fire that we saw last year. And scientists say that almost no matter what we do in terms of decarbonization, we're likely to see a 6-fold increase from here by 2050, which means that we're going to be seeing something on the order of 5 or 10% of the state burning every single year. Now we're also seeing, incredible flooding events across China. Millions of people evacuated every year. We've had horrible droughts and water shortages in India. The impacts across sub-Saharan Africa are actually much less well documented, which is, I think, something of a tragedy because there's just much less research focused there. But we have every reason to suspect that many of the impacts are just as dramatic or more dramatic there. But the example that I like to use most often, and I return to myself whenever I'm thinking about just how dramatically different the world is today than I thought it was even just a decade or so ago, is the experience of the city of Houston in Texas, which has been hit by 5 what are called 500-year storms in the last 5 years. So obviously climate change has made this term a little outdated. You can't have 500-year storms in 5 years. There's no longer a 500-year storm. And yet it reminds us just how different the world is now than when we even developed these terms just a few decades ago, because a 500-year storm means, a storm you'd expect to hit once every 500 years. And 500 years ago, no Europeans had even arrived in North America yet. Hernando Cortez had just landed in Mexico. So we're talking about a storm that you would expect to hit once in that entire history, from the arrival of European settlers, the building of colonies, the waging of a genocide against the native peoples, the fighting of a revolution, the building of a slave empire, the fighting of a civil war, American industrialization, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, the age of American empire, September 11th, the financial crisis, all of those things. We're talking about a storm that's supposed to hit once during that entire history. And Houston has been hit by 5 of those storms just in the last 5 years, which means we are literally condensing what should have been millennia of extreme weather disasters into just a few years, and delivering it on, in some cases, single cities. So I just saw a report today that the economic damage from one of those storms, Hurricane Harvey, and the recent ice storm in Texas that wiped out the Texas power grid, the economic impact of just those 2 events was equivalent to the GDP of Finland. So there's been as much devastation just wrought through those 2 disasters as an entire very wealthy country produces in a full year. And of course, it's not just Texas, it's not just the US. These are impacts that are happening just about everywhere in the world. We saw a Category 5 hurricane followed by a Category 4 hurricane just a week later in Honduras. It's a world beyond the imagining of anyone who had a clear understanding of the recent climate history of the planet. And that's especially concerning because it means that all of the things that we have built and all of the systems of human movement and economic activity that we have erected all around the world over the last few decades were built on suppositions about climate stability and our climate future that no longer hold. And that means that we're probably going to have to be doing a lot of rebuilding, renovating, and discarding, not just our direct infrastructure, but our social and political infrastructure too, to allow us to respond more nimbly to some of these challenges, and so that we can, to some degree, find ways to live in relatively just, relatively prosperous ways for decades to come.
So in fact, from everything that you're saying, David, the one thing that keeps getting reiterated is that so much of this has happened, like, when you're spelling out all that we are experiencing at this moment, a detail in your book that really caught my eye was that almost half of the carbon emission that we've put into the world has happened in the last 25 years. So that's while we've been aware of the phenomenon of climate change. And when you were spelling out all the current disasters that we're living through, even as we are knowing it, our minds are blunted and we're not willing to confront that we're already in the middle of catastrophe. You keep thinking that it's further away. So that's a good inflection point, David, to ask why, from knowing all of this, having been made the sort of high priest of climate alarmism, how come you suddenly started feeling more optimistic or feeling that there's cause for hope? Has the pandemic been an inflection point? Has it created a sense of awareness? What's making you hopeful right now?
Well, there are a few different ways to answer that question. On the personal level, I think the fact that I was so alarmed and wrote such an alarming book is part of the reason why I can now say I'm relatively speaking optimistic, because by any objective standard, the future that I see coming is not a happy one. It's just a bit more happy than I thought was coming a few years ago. So if someone was coming to the same subject fresh, I don't think that the world that I see likely in 2050 or 2075 would be all that comforting to them. It would probably be quite alarming to them too. But I happen to be coming to it from a baseline of pessimism and alarmism, so I'm relatively reassured. But I also think it's really important to say that, I'm often asked, is there reason for hope? What makes you optimistic? Because I think audiences, people who are struggling to process the meaning of this narrative, this meaning of this transformation, are eager to understand just how to orient their own emotions, their psychologies towards the future. And there is obviously value in that, but it's also the case that our moods don't matter. Whether I'm a little more optimistic than I was a year ago doesn't change the trajectory of the planet, which is still quite bleak. And I think we often try to process this tragedy that's unfolding as though it's ultimately about how we feel about the world. And I think that that's a quite narrow and blinkered and sort of morally evasive way of thinking about the problem, especially for someone like me, living with relative privilege in a relatively wealthy part of the world, and to some degree protected from the impacts of climate change that many billions of other people won't be. But I see hope and progress on a few different fronts. And I think there are a few different points to talk about. The first is that, just straightforwardly, many more countries are talking much more ambitiously about decarbonizing than they were a few years ago. Just during the pandemic year, you had really dramatic pledges towards net zero by China, South Korea, Japan, the EU as a whole, but a number of EU member countries. And Joe Biden ran for president on the US on a plan to get the US to get to zero carbon by 2050 as well, which means we're now at a place where something like 2/3 of the world's carbon emissions are at least nominally committed to rapid decarbonization. Now, all of those pledges are just pledges. Very few of them have been enacted into actionable law. Very few of them have detailed plans that allow us to totally trust that they will happen. But simply at the level of rhetorical commitment, it is, I think, really exciting and encouraging, not just because the level of ambition seems to have been raised, but because these countries are offering these pledges independent of one another, not in the context of a geopolitical conference like the Paris Accords, where there's peer pressure to act morally and maybe even more aggressive pressure levied on some countries by others, but because each of these countries see it in their own self-interest when developing their own economic plans for the next few decades to move off of fossil fuels and towards a renewable economy. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is that we now have a clearer sense of just how bad the fossil economy really is for us, most dramatically in our understanding of air pollution, which is, India is really, really suffering dramatically from it. The average resident of Delhi, his life expectancy is 8 years less than it would be without air pollution. So every resident of Delhi is losing 8 years of their life to air pollution. Hundreds of thousands of miscarriages and stillbirths just in India alone. And all around the world, we're talking about something like 9 million deaths every year from the effects of air pollution. And the effects are, it's not just whether it kills you or not, obviously. It also has an effect on cognitive performance, on economic activity, on low birth weight in children, on ADHD and respiratory disease and everything else that goes into living a good or sort of unhealthy life. We have a clearer sense of those impacts, which means that we have a clearer sense of the cost of inaction. But also we have a much sunnier view of what decarbonizing would do for us, in the sense that renewable energy is now much, much, much cheaper than it seemed was possible even a decade or so ago. The price of wind and solar and battery technology too, which is critical. All of these have fallen about tenfold in the last decade, which means now almost everywhere in the world, renewable energy is cheaper than dirty energy. And in fact, in many parts of the world, it's now cheaper to open new renewable capacity, to build new solar facilities or new wind facilities, than it is to even continue running existing fossil fuel plants. And that logic is so inarguable that many countries are moving much more quickly than was anticipated or expected, even in the sort of hopeful moment of the Paris Accords. And that's really great. But it's not just cold-eyed calculus. It's also because of the fear that extreme weather has put in so many people, especially over the last few years. We've seen much more intense natural disaster impacts all around the world, but I would say especially we're starting to see them more and more in the global north, in Europe and North America, and that has had a really dramatic impact on public opinion in those countries. And because of the political movement that has grown up over the last few years, really just over the last few years, the global political movement, maybe embodied most dramatically by Greta Thunberg, although she's certainly not the only figure doing it, we're seeing climate become a cause of real political activism and pressure. And that has meant a number of things. But I think maybe most dramatically, it's given everyone in the world the sense that these changes are going to happen. We may not do it fast enough to avert really dramatic warming. I think we will still be dealing with quite dramatic impacts. And yet, if we take for granted, as I think almost everyone on the planet now does in a way they didn't a few years ago, that at some point, at some pace, at some speed, we will decarbonize, then that changes a lot of long-term planning in corporate boardrooms and in parliaments, and even in terms of like down to the individual homeowner talking about where to buy or build their home. There's a sort of a cultural shift happening as well, a generational shift in which it's no longer possible to even really believe that we won't take action. The question is how much and how fast. Yeah. And as a result of that, climate action seems much more manageable and doable and indeed inevitable. And we're seeing the result of that all across the board, where, we haven't really decarbonized much at all globally. Certain countries have, but at the global level, we haven't. Last year, there was a dip in emissions, but we're expected to have a rebound this year. Maybe not all the way up to the peak, but basically to the peak. But we're putting in we've now essentially built all of this cultural infrastructure and economic infrastructure that will allow decarbonization to happen quite quickly if we let it. And a few years ago, it would have required a sort of moral choice to burden ourselves with an expensive project of decarbonization. And now it just seems like everything's moving in that direction, and we don't need to worry too much, about the direction of change, just about the speed and scale of change.
The fact that China has unilaterally declared that it's going to move towards a net zero by 2050, and he's an economic...
They're 2060. They're the one that's like a little later than everybody else, but
2060, right. But Adam Tooze, who's an economic historian, and he's not given to, large sweeping statements, but he said that this act could single-handedly change human future. I haven't gone in deeply enough into it, but India has said that it would go towards, creating more renewable energy in 40% of its energy pie, and that we're already there, though we had promised to do it by 2030, but apparently we're already 38.5% renewable energies, So those are very hopeful things. But the question I wanted to ask you, David, was that, recently in India, there was this big controversy around Greta Thunberg's toolkit, and there were youngsters in India who were arrested for an international conspiracy. And the thing that came up was the whole Extinction Rebellion movement, Would you, for audiences who are not familiar with that, would you talk about that? And what do you yourself feel about, kind of very sort of escalated climate action that young people are taking, and what impact that's having?
Well, Extinction Rebellion it's a British movement. It has now a network that extends all over the world, but it was based originally in London, and it started a few years ago now, or actually around the time that Greta was becoming a global figure herself. And they are quite alarmist about the impacts of climate change. I mean, their name is quite dark. When I first heard of them a few falls ago, I actually thought it was a sort of a needlessly bleak self-branding, and that they were going to alienate many people who would be their natural allies through their branding and through their messaging. And they are very, very clear about just how dramatic and difficult these changes will be if we don't take really meaningful, immediate action today. They are among the activists who say that many of these net zero pledges are inadequate and insufficient for two reasons. The first is the net part, which is to say that a lot of them count on carbon offsets or negative emissions, which is not really an approach that has been proven at scale. And even if it worked, would require such large, if you're doing natural versions of it, such large amounts of land, or if you're doing technological versions of it, so much power that it would really completely change the face of the planet. They also say that the targets are too distant. So if you are a country or a corporation saying you're going to get to net zero by 2050, among other things, that's saying, get off my back for the next decade or two. I don't have to do anything right now. So XR has been really, really powerfully influential in England in particular. They, I think, were a really important, force in driving a conservative majority in Parliament led by Boris Johnson to really enact some quite ambitious climate pledges, although, of course, XR is not as happy with the climate pledges as many other people might be. Greta and her movement, the school strike movement, have they work from a similar understanding of the science as XR, but they're a little less dark in their messaging. And I think it's one reason why they've had more of a global appeal. As I said, XR has really done best in England, where there's a very high level of environmental concern to begin with. The rhetoric of the climate strikers is different, but it is really just as urgent. In Greta's major debut speech, she said, "I want you to act as your house is on fire," and that is the sort of direct message of her worldview, and it's been carried forward by many of these incredibly brave climate strikers all around the world. And personally, I find these movements exhilarating and inspiring. When I first started working on climate a few years ago, I looked back at a history of environmental activism and advocacy, decades in which many good people spent a lot of effort fighting for these same causes with basically nothing to show for it. And I thought, I knew that if we were to get a handle on this problem, it would have to be through politics. And I thought that activism of this kind, demonstrations in the street and protests was going to have to be a part of it, because it did require such a dramatic change in the way that our political systems and political economies really operated. But I also thought, what were the chances of that actually happening? The systems that were aligned against climate action were so strong, and the forces of climate activism seemed to me at the time quite weak. But Greta and the rest of the climate strikers have really, really reversed that dynamic in a quite inspiring way. And, I say that at a global level. I think we're in a very different place. I think the world is more alarmed about climate change because of the climate strikers. And as a result, our politics now reflects much more climate urgency than it would have reflected without them. I don't ask Greta or XR or any of these other movements. I wouldn't ask of them to have exactly my politics or exactly my sense of urgency. In general, I think this is a movement that is too big to try to confine to any one narrow part of the band and say, this is exactly what we think is going to happen. This is the messaging we need to have. This is what we're going to ask for. I think we need to take as many people who are as concerned about this as we possibly can, because the changes we need are so large that we need a really big tent. In fact, we need a lot of hypocrites on board too. But what inspires me most about the climate strikers is the way in which they argue against my own reflexive sense of impotence. And I think the sense that many people all around the world have felt about climate change for a long time, which is to say, this is a global system. It has so many feeds. It has so many powerful entities have stakes in continuing the operation of the system as it is. And you think, even if you are alarmed about it, even if you're terrified about it, you think, what could I possibly do? I'm just one person. But these climate strikers are, almost to an individual, they're minors, which means that they can't vote anywhere in the world, even in those places where there are open and fair elections. But many of them are striking in places where there are not open and fair elections. Many of them are from, ethnic minorities, marginalized communities. Many of them turn out to be queer. These are people who are, by almost every metric, to the extent that I felt disempowered looking at the problem, they are many, many, many more times disempowered than I am. And yet they looked at the same problem and didn't feel themselves intimidated or dejected by the power imbalance that they saw staring them in the face. Instead, they felt mobilized, motivated, invigorated by it, and said, we're going to do what we can to make a place for ourselves at this table. And miraculously, they did in a relatively short amount of time. So in the US, the leading climate protest movement is called the Sunrise Movement. It's led by a really inspiring woman named Varshini Prakash. And, they basically were unheard of in the fall of 2018. They attached themselves to AOC and were a powerful force between the initial articulation of the Green New Deal, which is itself quite inspiring for an upstart group. But even more than that, what has been really amazing to me to watch is the way in which they've totally infiltrated the power structure of the Democratic Party in the US. So this is a group that, in giving report cards to the presidential candidates, graded Joe Biden an F. They found him a totally unacceptable candidate because, in the past, he's had a long history in politics at a time when climate wasn't as present. So his record is not so great in the past. But in part because he is the sort of leader he is, who wants to sort of keep the peace and put himself at the center of American liberalism, no matter where that's moving, and in part because of Sunrise advocacy and sort of stick-to-itiveness, they formed a kind of amazing alliance. And even though Sunrise had given him a failing grade in the primary, he invited Varshini into his policy team to help write his climate plan. There were other people in there who weren't quite as progressive on climate, but the fact that she sort of made a place for herself at this very seat of power within a year or two of announcing her movement to begin with is, I think, astonishing. And I think it teaches us all that we should be considerably less cynical about the political power that we have ourselves and understand just how much more, not just of the future is changeable, but how much of the present tense of power politics around climate, but not just around climate, is changeable through the force of political will and political commitment.
Yeah, that's a fantastic message that you've just given, David. And I think it really kind of foregrounds it because, there's just so much of cloud around this, but ultimately it's storytelling. And like you said, so many generations earlier weren't capturing the imagination, but these young people have really told the story compellingly. They've told it well. And like you said, penetrated the most impenetrable structures of power, So in fact, that makes the whole controversy in India around these young people that much more ludicrous, and actually deeply embarrassing, apart from distressing, that there could be such a misinterpretation of what the climate strikers really stand for, So, David, one other thing was that you mentioned about infrastructure, and there's a kind of cynicism around even the renewable economy, because it's going to take so much of fossil energy to create the instruments of renewable economy. So there's that whole talk about embedded, sort of the embedded energetics of all of this. So how when we're saying that we're moving into the whole renewable economy, how do you think about that? Again, there's an interesting thing which you yourself pointed out, that if cement was a country, then it would be the third biggest emitter of carbon in the world. So, but all these materials are going to be used even in the renewable economy. So, how do we deal with this whole infrastructure question? When we're dealing with climate change?
Well, there are a few different issues. There's sort of, how do we minimize or ideally eliminate the carbon impact of producing carbon-free energy? What it takes to make a wind turbine, as we're building our electric grid, that kind of thing. And that is, a technical question, but I think it is manageable. The thing that is a lot less manageable is the environmental impact of that work, which is to say, we're going to have to do an enormous amount of lithium mining. There are many other rare earth materials that we're going to have to be producing at really dramatic scale to sort of sustain the global appetite for energy if we're delivering that energy from renewable sources. And that does probably mean a whole new sort of industrial extractivist regime to sustain this new stable renewable future. And I think for a lot of people, especially veterans of environmental movements in the past, this is quite discomforting. And I understand why that is the case. You don't want to see a whole nation, the nation of Bolivia or huge parts of China, totally turned into, an ugly industrial mining operation, so that people in Norway and Finland can get their clean energy. There's something quite ugly about that, in part because of the geopolitics of it, but also just because of the aesthetics of it. On the other hand, I sort of feel like we don't really have another option. There are those who feel that nuclear power should be a bigger part of the solution. I'm sort of agnostic about that. I think that there are reasons why nuclear might be able to help, but at the moment it's much more expensive than new renewable energy. And so it probably doesn't make sense to focus our attention there, at least until we develop some new nuclear technology that could be run more cheaply. So that's on like the sort of energy production side. And, I think it's important to keep in mind that, if you have an electric car and you plug it into a plug that is being powered by a dirty energy source, it's not any better than driving your gas-powered car, or it's only slightly better than driving your gas-powered car. So we need a sort of systemic rethink and rebuild of those energy systems. And that will be quite resource intensive. It will be, to a certain extent, carbon intensive. But if we manage those transitions with an eye towards limiting the carbon impact, I think ultimately the payoffs just far outweigh the costs in terms of carbon. The other infrastructure projects, for instance, housing or cement, concrete, air travel, other kind of transportation infrastructure. These are a little bit more challenging to totally decarbonize in the short term. It's one reason why we need to decarbonize our energy sector faster, because it'll sort of buy us a little time to do innovation on the other end. But there is, in the sort of lab scale, there is now carbon-free cement. It can be made. It's expensive. Hopefully the price will fall soon. Same is true of sort of carbon-free jet fuel. It's not at a scale that could be at all used to power the world's airline industry, but we can fly a plane some amount of distance with carbon-free fuel. Maybe 10 years from now or 15 years from now, we'll be able to be making those flights, much longer distances and in many more parts of the world. But these are all complicated, thorny challenges. I think we should all keep in mind in thinking about this climate future, that we have passed the point of comfort. And there is no future that won't involve some amount of climate pain. And a lot of what we're going to be doing in an erratic way, sometimes in punitive ways, sometimes in ways that really reflect the worst sides of us, and sometimes I hope reflect the better sides of us, are going to be engaged in trade-off thinking, where we assess the relative value versus the relative pain of some innovation or investment. And ultimately, on the big picture, I do think that framing is really vital to keep in mind, that we are engaged in this project globally. It has global impacts, and that we can't think narrowly in terms of our own personal or local or even national self-interest if we hope to think morally and ethically about this whole engineering project writ large. Because already today, in too many parts of the world, we are simply blind to the suffering and struggles of people living elsewhere. And we need a more universal empathic approach to human life if we are to engineer a kind of supportive and just climate future. We're not there yet. Our politics is kind of broken and tortured and tangled. But I would like to think, among many other things, that climate change has the potential to teach us about our shared fate. I think there's a risk that it teaches us something else, that it teaches us that we need to go get ours and not worry about other people. But I want to at least hold out hope that a sort of more generous and cosmopolitan future is in the cards, not just coincidentally to serve the needs that climate change brings, but maybe because of what climate change tells us about what we need to do for ourselves and for each other.
But that's a great note to end on, actually, David. But I'm just going to ask you a curious thing as well, which you've been pointing out, which is that, the years that Trump was the president, America completely fell out of the climate change conversation. And one would have thought that that's a kind of leadership position, though America's not always been very forthcoming on the climate change debate. But, even then, just that their part in the conversation would be missed. But you said that actually its absence from the conversation ended up being positive in its own way. Would you spell that out?
Well, I'm not sure that I would say that that dynamic was causal exactly, but it happens to be the case that the 4 years that the US had totally retreated from climate negotiations were the 4 years in which the most action had ever happened on the planet. I do think that there was a dynamic with China where Xi Jinping was eager to play the climate hero in a way that he might not have been if the American president was also banging on about climate at the same time. He wants to shame the U.S. He wants to challenge the U.S. and wants to, especially for the nations of Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, to whom he is serving as a kind of an infrastructure advisor and investor. He wants to be able to say, we are the force of good in the future, and the U.S. is a force of climate hypocrisy and climate villainy. And in fact, he's used some of that language explicitly since he made his net zero announcement. Some of the other dynamics are a little more complicated. I think that the EU, for instance, was sort of well on its way to many of these commitments and may have even been pushed a little faster if there had been an American partner. But the truth is that I'm an American. The Americans like to talk about themselves as being central to the climate cause, and because we remain the sort of world's preeminent superpower, if perhaps not for all that long. We have always been at the main table, at the main negotiating table at these conferences. But we also have a long history of backing out of those agreements, failing to honor them, walking away from the negotiating table very sort of selfishly, like a toddler. And so, there's also a version of the narrative that says, what have we ever gotten from the U.S. anyway? We need to get it we need to move forward on our own. And I think what we've seen over the last 4 years is that moved from a kind of like rueful, resentful perspective among climate leaders elsewhere around the world to a real plan of action. And in part, that reflects some of the changing dynamics we were talking about earlier, where this is no longer a sacrifice that nations have to make for the betterment of one another. It now appears to be a really productive investment for each of them in the short term, no matter where they fall on the trajectory of development. So it's not just that, Norway or Denmark might be able to do well by decarbonizing, but also the case that India or the Philippines or Indonesia could do the same. And as the combination of all those factors, I think, has produced an incredibly productive 4-year period. It's not nearly as much as we need. We need to accelerate all those pledges, all those ambitions, and we need to actually, kind of make concrete the gains that they promise. But it suggests that the landscape of possibility that we're now staring down today in 2021, especially with, Joe Biden now in the White House and much more focused on climate than he was when he was vice president, it does seem like a whole new realm of possibilities floats before us. We need to make those real. We need to take action to make them real. But what once seemed sort of irresponsible to even dream of now seems achievable, if sort of difficult. And the things that now seem likely are much better than the things that seemed likely just a few years ago. And the things that seemed likely a few years ago now seem quite unlikely. And as a result, the whole shape of our future has really improved. As I said at the beginning, it's not a future that our grandparents would have recognized as comfortable, and it will still require an enormous amount of adaptation to allow us to live in ways that continue to extend promises of prosperity and human flourishing and justice. But it looks much better than it did, to me at least, a couple of years ago. And I think as someone who's really worried about the climate, you got to sort of, take and applaud progress when you see it. So I'm personally grateful for what we've seen, even knowing, as I know, that we need a whole lot more.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation. I hope we cross paths again soon.